Mr. Dreyer at Minchville High School, here to teach you another lesson of AP government. Today we're going to talk about the ratification of the Constitution. Before we do that, I want to mention three different types of democracy that are actually in the AP curriculum. Here we see participatory democracy, pluralist democracy, and elite democracy. Basically, these are broad ideas about how a democracy can be run and who can participate in it. In a participatory model, pretty much everyone has a chance to equally influence democracy. And in this idea, the democracy is set up so it can get feedback from all sorts of different types of people. One example might be in the Constitution. The representatives are directly elected by the people in the states. So everybody has a say in who the representatives are. In fact, in the Constitution, only the representatives were directly elected, and we'll go into that later. Pluralist democracy is the idea that groups can influence the democratic process. So today that would be groups like maybe the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the Sierra Club, which is an environmental group. And there's a lot of other different types of groups and organizations that seek to influence policy in various ways, which we'll also go over later. Elite democracy is this idea that really democracy should be limited to a small group of people. And in the Constitution, this idea is seen most clearly in the electoral college system, or the system of how we elect the president. In that system, basically the states chose the electors that would then choose the president. They did not have a direct election for president because they felt like the average person didn't really have enough information and knowledge to make such an important decision. So, you need to know these three types of democracy. They will be on AP quizzes, and they will be on the AP test. Moving on, let's look at the AP curriculum guidelines. They want you to know Federalist 10 as a foundational document and Brutus number 1 as a foundational document, which you see right here. Now, yet again, what does a foundational document mean? It means that they might take excerpts from these documents and put them on FRQs. And you would have to then use those excerpts to interpret what you know about the document to then answer the FRQ or even the multiple choice question. So it's important to know the basic ideas in these documents. You don't have to know everything about it, but the basic idea. Let's talk about how the Constitution was ratified. We know the Constitution was written at a convention in Philadelphia. And then all of the delegates at the convention had to go home to their states. And 9 of the 13 states had to vote or ratify the Constitution and vote yes before it took effect. So all 13 states had basically a vote about whether they wanted to adopt this new form of government. So there was a period of time between when the Constitution was written and when it was actually ratified. During that time, there were people called Federalists, and these are people who supported the ratification of the Constitution. They wanted it ratified. They said it was good, and they had reasons. The three main Federalists that you need to know are Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. Now, there were many other Federalists. Why are we looking at these three? Because they wrote 85 combined essays, and these essays were published in the papers of the time to try to influence the decisions about why people should ratify the Constitution. Now, to be fair, John Jay only wrote a handful, so the bulk of them are written by Hamilton and then Madison. And I actually read something the other day, an article where it mentioned that the Federalist Papers probably actually didn't have much of an impact on whether it was ratified or not, because some states had already ratified it before the papers were even published, and they also had limited distributions in New York and other places. So it's not like everybody read these papers and said, oh, that's a great reason. I'm definitely going to ratify the Constitution now. But these documents are important to us today because they lay out the reasoning of the people who wanted a strong government. And they explain parts of the government. They explain checks and balances. Okay, let's look at these states. You would never have to memorize this on a test. But this is the ratification of the Constitution, and we see that Delaware was the first state to ratify it in 1787. So basically, this is right after the Constitutional Convention was over. The convention was over towards the end of summer, so it took a few months, and they voted right away. And as you can see, 30 voted for it and 0 against it. So obviously, Delaware really wanted this new government. And actually, cool side fact, Delaware is known as the first state because it ratified the Constitution first. And then you see Pennsylvania and so on. And actually, since you're AP students, what can we get from this chart and this map? Well, I don't know. There's a lot of information here, but one thing we can say for sure is that some states, it was very close about whether they wanted to ratify or not. Look at Massachusetts, 187 for, 168 against. Even look at Virginia, 89 for, 79 against. So it's not like every single person thought the Constitution was amazing, thought this new form of government was the best, and that we should actually adopt it. There was a healthy debate about whether they should actually do this. Because think about it, you're taking a government that's basically a confederation. It's 13 independent countries. It's pretty loose. It gives these independent states, countries, a lot of power. And you're transferring a lot of that power up into a national government. And that's what scared people. It scared people because they had just fought a war to get rid of a king. And now they're thinking, wait a minute, we just got rid of this tyranny. We got rid of King George. And now we're sort of creating something that's very similar to it that might take our rights away. And people had issues with that. In the map, we can sort of say that a lot of the Federalists seem to be clustered in cities and on the coast, but it's hard to say. So the map is not super enlightening. Now, there's two documents that we really need to talk about here. One is Brutus number 1, and the other one is Federalist 10. You see these documents juxtaposed a lot. Now, what does that mean? It means that these documents are diametrically opposed. One of the documents, Brutus 1, argues against ratification. In this document, the author says the government will be too powerful and it will not work. The person who wrote this was not named Brutus. Actually, this is named after the Brutus who helped murder Julius Caesar. And they probably used that pen name because Brutus didn't want Julius Caesar to become basically a dictator and take all the power away from the Roman Republic. So there's that naming going on. We don't know for sure who wrote this document, but there's about 2 or 3 people they've narrowed it down to. So Brutus 1 is an anti-federalist, someone who does not want the Constitution to be ratified, someone who is against a powerful national government. And the second document is Federalist number 10, written by Madison, which argues for a strong national government. So basically these documents are taking different sides of an issue. An example might be today someone would argue for gun control and someone would argue against it. So that's exactly what these documents are doing. They're arguing for a strong government or against a strong government. You need to know a couple of major points from Brutus 1 and Federalist 10 because they pop up on FRQs and quizzes and tests quite a bit. So let's go ahead and see what Brutus's main argument is. And by the way, this document is actually quite long, so I just took a few of the little pieces out of it that you're more likely to see on a test. He says the first question that presents itself on the subject of whether a confederated government be the best of the United States or not. A confederated government was the type of government they had under the Articles of Confederation. In a confederated government, you have these smaller pieces. You can call them states. So we have 13 states, and there's a national government. But basically, the national government gets all of its power from the states. So the smaller units of the government are more powerful than the national government. In a federalist type of government, the national government gives power, shares power with these states, but the federal government is stronger. So that's really all it's all about. Or in other words, whether the 13 United States should be reduced to one great republic, governed by one legislature and under the direction of one executive and judicial. He says that because if you think about it, under this system of 13 different states, there's literally 13 different legislative assemblies, and each state has one. There's 13 different executives. Each state has a governor, and there's 13 different judicial systems. Each state has their own types of courts with their own laws. It would be the same as if you went from Canada to the US. There's different laws, different courts, different people that are elected. Or whether they should continue 13 confederated republics. So he says that's the big argument. Should we adopt this constitution or not? Should we have a confederated type of government where the power is split into small units, or should it be under a stronger national government? This government is to possess absolute and uncontrollable power. And actually, that's his spelling, not mine. Legislative, executive, and judicial, with respect to every object to which it extends. For by the last clause, Section 8, Article 1, it is declared that the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So what's his major point here? He says, look, I've read the Constitution. In the Constitution, it lists the powers that the government will have. The government can make an army. The government can tax. The government can control trade. And these are enumerated powers, we'll go over these later. So it lists out the power that the federal government should have, but at the end, it says they can also make any law that they need to in order to carry out these lists of powers. And there's a name for that in the Constitution. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. This is also called implied powers. Now, why are they implied? Because they are not listed. They are not directly listed in the Constitution. It's just implied the federal government has more power. And his issue is that since it's implied, it's an open-ended sort of power, that the federal government will actually be much stronger than people think. And the example I always tell students in class is, I have certain powers that are given to me by the principal, specifically to be a teacher. And I have the power to do things, but really it's very vague. It just says that you will go into your class and teach the curriculum and do these things. Well, then I have other implied powers. I need to have some powers in order to teach my class. I have the power to write students up. I have the power to sometimes put students out of the class if they're misbehaving. I have the power to basically give all sorts of different tests and quizzes based on what I think is the best. So teachers themselves have a lot of implied power. It's not all just specifically written in a list of what we can and can't do. And the reason they put that into the Constitution is because they didn't know all the powers the Constitution needed, and so they needed to have sort of a flexible clause. So this clause, this sentence is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's called implied powers. It's also called the elastic clause, meaning it can be stretched. And the author, Brutus, said this is a problem. This will give the government too much power. So his big first issue is too much power will lead to tyranny because of this clause, this one sentence. His second issue is that a free republic cannot succeed over a country of such immense extent, containing such a number of inhabitants, and these increasing in such rapid progression. Really what he's saying is this new country will be too big. And when you get a big country, you get many different types of ideas. And the ideas change a lot from whether you're in Virginia to Massachusetts to Georgia. And so with all of these different types of people who have their regional ideas, it's impossible for everyone to get together and make one country because nobody will ever agree on anything. And that's his issue with the country being big. He uses the term republic. and we are a republic technically, but he says it's too big, too many different types of people, and his other issue with it being too big is that the representatives that are elected will be elected by a huge group of people. He's like, well, each representative is elected by like 30,000 people. So your representative doesn't know these people, and there's too much of a distance between the elected officials and the people they should be accountable to. And he has a valid point there. And by the way, that distance increases as you go farther up the spectrum. So if you're in a city, well, it depends on the size of the city. If you're in New York City, the mayor is elected by millions of people. If you're in a small little city, say your city has 2,000 people, the mayor is elected by a small group of people. So this idea of the distance between the elected official and the constituents, or the people electing them, is important because he says it holds them accountable. Okay, so those are his big arguments. That's really what you need to know. Too much power, it will be tyrannical. It's too big, and with it being too big, there's too many different types of ideas, and there's really not enough accountability of representatives because they're elected by a large group of people. He says, in a republic, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. If this be not the case, there will be a constant clashing of opinions, and the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of the other. This will retard the operations of government, meaning stop or halt or make it inefficient, and prevent such conclusions as will promote the public good. So he's like, look, everyone's going to be arguing constantly. We'll never get anything done. Ironically, that has happened. He didn't really have this idea of political parties, but today we could say, well, Republicans and Democrats, the two major parties, argue constantly and they rarely pass laws. And it's difficult for them to compromise. So he has some ideas that are definitely correct and some that may not be correct. It's really up to you to decide. Now let's go to Federalist 10, which was written by Madison, James Madison. Now he's using the term factions. When he says factions, he means different groups of people with different ideas. Today we would think of political parties, but back then they didn't have organized political parties. He says factions are bad, but we can't get rid of them without getting rid of liberty or changing human nature. Think about it. People are going to argue. People are going to have different opinions. That's human nature. He's like, we can't get rid of them by making laws. If we make so many laws to get rid of different opinions, we will not have liberty. So what's the point? So he's like, look, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. So today we would think of this as groups of people that have different ideas, either in the majority or the minority. He says a large republic with many different interests will make it harder for factions to rule. So here's the reason why he's directly opposite Brutus 1. Brutus says big is bad because there are too many different types of people and it will be impossible to rule. Madison says big is good because there are different types of people. But his conclusion is that different types of people are great. Different ideas are good because then no one group of people will be able to control the rest. So no faction will be able to make laws for everybody else because a difference of opinion actually is the only way to sort of provide a check on the power of majorities or even minorities. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice. So Brutus says the distance between the representative and the person that they are representing, the constituent, is too great, and it will lead to bad representatives. Unworthy people will be in government. Madison says this distance is good because basically the exact opposite. Basically, he's like, well, this distance is good because no one representative can just be elected by their friends or a small group of people, and it will be harder for bad people to get elected, and that's a good thing. He says, extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. So yet again, he's saying make a big country with a lot of different types of people, and it's going to make it really hard for one type of person to then dominate the rest and take away their liberty. So that's why these two documents are used often in AP class, and that is why they are foundational documents. You might see these specific sentences on test, and then it might ask you to interpret them, or it might ask you to draw a conclusion or to relate it to some other thing. So you definitely need to know these major ideas. Okay, I hope that helped you understand Brutus 1 and Federalist 10. And by the way, obviously we know the Constitution was ratified and every state agreed, and after every state agreed, then we became the United States, and they had the first Congress. And since then, government has definitely evolved quite a bit, which we will talk about. So in the next lessons coming up, we're going to talk about the Constitution specifically, and then we're going to talk about some things in it, and then we'll talk about federalism.